So, not to cosplay as an anxious PhD student procrastinating on their dissertation, but honestly, what's the point of philosophy anyway? Seriously though, why do we care so much about what a bunch of dead people think about a whole host of speculative questions? And in particular, why do we take our ethical cues from a bunch of folks who would get immediately canceled in 2023? Well, the classic answer is that philosophy is about the teaching of the good life, and that by learning from tradition, we can get closer to living the good life ourselves. But that still doesn't really answer the question, who are philosophers to tell us how to live our lives? Especially as many of them are, to be generous, ivory tower nerds who have been in college since they were 18 and have never worked a real job. Folks for whom all that really matters is securing the most prestigious job so they can have as much time as possible to write about old books and listen to themselves talk, and in some cases, form weird thruples with current students and ex-partners. And that's before we even get into the great philosophers who are about as wretched a pile of deviants as you could ever hope to meet. We've got Nazis, we've got fans of slavery, we've got murderers, and basically all of them are adulterers to boot. And these guys are supposed to teach ethics to me, a man who's never been a Nazi, a fan of slavery, or a murderer. And to be clear, in case my wife is watching, an adulterer, because with all this content I gotta make, when would I even have time for that? So what's the deal? Do philosophers need to be ethical themselves to teach us how to be good people? And if so, which philosophers are actually worth taking ethical advice from? Let's get into it in this Wisecrack Edition. Can we learn ethics from jerks? Okay, if you're unfamiliar with the chronicles of badly behaved philosophers, here's a little buffet of depravity. So we got Kant's lectures on anthropology, which contain a hierarchy of races, arguably inspiring the tradition of scientific racism. Similarly, David Hume claimed that other races were inferior to white people. And though he claimed to be anti-slavery, he helped his patron purchase a plantation. For his part, Aristotle defended slavery as a natural institution and dropped lines like, "A slave is a living possession," and "From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule." And for a bonus track, "The male is by nature superior and the female inferior." In case you're just coming in there, this is not a video on Andrew Tate. This is on philosophy, so there you go. But if you did come for a video on Andrew Tate, stay, because this will be way more helpful. But wait! There's more! Martin Heidegger was a literal member of the Nazi Party. Yes, that Nazi party. When Ludwig Wittgenstein was a schoolteacher, he beat a boy until he was unconscious. Jeremy Bentham was an enthusiastic designer of prisons, the Panopticon. Ever heard of it? That was him. Peter Singer has argued for the consensual banging of animals.
So
they consent.
If you like, they consent as much as animals can ever consent to anything, yeah, sure.
And his work has been accused of essentially advocating for the genocide of people with disabilities. He says, as long as you please her, that you can bang a dolphin. Don't do that. Wisecrack says, don't bang animals. These philosophers are often no better in their personal lives. Louis Althusser murdered his wife, after which he was declared mentally unfit to stand trial and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Schopenhauer stalked young women and pushed an old woman down a flight of stairs. No word on how he treated middle-aged women, but I'm gonna guess, not great. For his part, Jean-Jacques Rousseau fathered 5 children by a woman he then eviscerated in his autobiography, and he gave all the children away to an orphanage shortly after their births. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir had sexual relations with their students. I mean, they were French, but still. And Soren Kierkegaard suddenly broke off his engagement to his fiancée, then used the breakup in his writing to make some aesthetic point, which his fiancée was definitely not impressed by. The list goes on. We need a much longer video to shout out all the philosophers who cheated on their partners. If you're a philosopher who cheats on your partner, shout it out in the comments. Use your full name and your academic position. So we've established that many philosophers who are professionally obligated to contemplate how to live a good life are still often badly behaved pieces of shit with some really up ideas. So you might be asking, why should we follow in their wake or even take their ideas seriously? So to think about that, let's go back to Immanuel Kant and his objectively very bad anthropological hierarchy of races. In his lectures on anthropology, Kant established a lineal root genus race that all others descended from, which was white of brownish color. Oh boy. From there we get, in descending order, noble blonde, Northern Europe from humid cold, copper red America from dry cold. And you know, from here, it's where he just very much gets racist. I'm not gonna read some of this. So it's on the screen, check it out. It's not good. It's not good, guys. It's not good. Now, he did argue all of this in the context of saying that humans are all part of one common species. But yeah, it's still racist as fuck. But it's also worth saying that Kant was not only a racist. He was a lot of things, including one of the most important and influential moral philosophers of all time. He's the guy that came up with the categorical imperative. And he was also someone whose work was and is extremely hard to understand. If you want to see this in action, pause the video, go start reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and then come back here and let me know how it's going. In a way, then, it would be way easier if Kant was simply a racist, because then we could just dismiss his work wholesale. No more need to talk about the transcendental unity of a perception, or the thing in itself, or the aforementioned categorical imperative. Kant was a racist bitch! But it's still more complicated than that. In fact, regardless of what Kant wrote in his anthropology lectures, in much more central parts of his work, he writes about ideas that are just utterly in contradiction with racism. His entire ethical framework is structured around the idea that we should only treat other people as ends in themselves, never as means to our ends. His categorical imperative is act only under a maxim that would work as a universal law, i.e. one that applies to everyone, just so long as they are human. His ethics must thus apply to all human beings, or it would be nothing. That implies treating people equally regardless of their culture or the color of their skin. So even by Kant's own moral philosophy, the race hierarchy stuff is bullshit, which is good. But also, if it's in contradiction with his greater system, did he just write that shit because it was a fun way to spend an evening? God, I'm so glad we have streaming television so we don't have to sit at home and write hierarchies of races for fun. Because that's what we'd do if we didn't have Netflix. This contradiction is further borne out in Kant's political philosophy. In his influential essay, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose, Kant discusses the ways in which we might see a peaceful global order as emerging from conflicts between peoples over time. In this sort of proto-Hegelian essay, he argues that conflicts and antagonisms are what lead to human development at both the individual and societal level. He writes, the history of mankind can be seen in the large as the realization of nature's secret plan to bring forth a perfectly constituted state as the only condition in which the capacities of mankind can be fully developed, and also bring forth that external relation among states which is perfectly adequate to this end. So rather than some type of racist hellscape, Kant is arguing for the necessity of a universal civic society which will create a common law amongst men. Now, is there some major Eurocentric bias here? Totally. Kant's ideal global society looks like a sort of confederation of enlightened European-style monarchies. But what Kant writes is precisely not compatible with the idea that anyone might be excluded on grounds of race. Let's get back to it. Yes, Kant was racist in some respects, but his more complex ideas offer some pretty compelling counter-arguments against himself. And despite his personal leanings, anyone actually following his maxims would necessarily need to divest of racism in order to be morally good. And this is also a really good example of one of the most important things a reader of philosophy or any subject for that matter can do, which is to read an author against themselves, holding them up to their own conceptual standard. But we can only appreciate Kant's internal contradictions once we move past the blanket assessment that he was a bad person. When we dig into the details of his work, it seems we can actually learn from him regardless of his problematic opinions. And like our recent video about separating the art from the artist, this involves separating the historical existence of a philosopher from their text. For this reason, X was a bad person does not seem like a complete knockdown critique of their systems as a whole, and risks being lazy. Kant, like just about everyone, was in contradiction against himself in certain ways, and his work reflects that. It's up to us to puzzle through his many complex ideas, and if we take the time to do so, we can apply them to our real lives, and maybe even do a way better job at it than he did. So there's reasons to think we can learn ethics from bad people. After all, no one is a wholly indivisible unity, entirely good or bad. This strikes us as a very good thing indeed, because the hard truth is we have to learn ethics from bad people, or we won't learn them at all. And we aren't just talking about learning ethics from bad philosophers, because, well, just think about how we learn the difference between right and wrong in the first place. Star Wars, obviously.
I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
So who teaches us to be good people? Usually our parents, or primary caregivers of whatever sort. And were these people objectively good? Maybe, if you were very lucky. But some of us were raised by mothers who once told us she had a favorite bar in Chicago in the late 70s where for $5 you could get a beer and a bump of Coke, which is a real thing that my mom said to me. But parents are just as likely to be shitty and selfish and a bit wrong-headed as the rest of us, and many are. So if we couldn't learn anything about ethics from bad people, then no one would ever learn anything about ethics at all. Kindergartners would be 100% less likely to share their crayons. In a way, maybe we can even learn more from bad people because we can witness the very real harms of unethical behavior and ideas, which is why I now always prefer bars that just serve drinks and not fentanyl-laced cocaine. Of course, none of this is easy, which is why learning ethics from flawed people can be anxiety-inducing. For example, if your parents were perfect, like say the parents on beloved WB program, Seventh Heaven, you could just copy them uncritically without having to anxiously navigate existence and morality for yourself. This is why for the existentialist, moral systems like those offered by Kant can sometimes be a distraction from developing actual moral subjectivity for yourself. Sort of like the difference between learning how to mimic Jimi Hendrix's hands move on a guitar and learning to understand the music and melodic structures for yourself. Oh, also, the guy who played the dad in Seventh Heaven, he turned out to be a real-life sex criminal, so sorry if that's who you modeled your ethics on. There's a reasonable human desire for moral purity, to orient our ethics around something or someone that is indisputable. Why else would we believe in a supreme being in the sky who's always right, even when he wipes out the entire world except for one wooden yacht full of animals? Thank God Peter Singer wasn't on that yacht, if you know what I mean. Maybe explain it in the comments for those who didn't get this one. The reality is far more unsettling, that our entire lives will be spent navigating complicated moral tensions that no one person can perfectly solve for us. It requires a lot more work and comes with the brutal reality that we won't always get things right. This is why Kierkegaard can write a book about ethics, fear and trembling, that is mostly about a guy who almost killed his son with a knife because God told him to. Now, philosophy is about learning how to live a good life, and it would rule if the best philosophers were all kind, just, upstanding citizens rather than Nazi curious or strangle happy, because then we could just copy them. But there's something very simplistic at the heart of our initial question, because it presumes that ethical philosophy is prescriptive, and that folks like Kant are writing their own golden rules. But in reality, the greatest ethical thinkers aren't Dear Abby telling us how to get along with our mother-in-law. Rather, they articulate questions that help us interrogate how to live ethically. And eventually, after 10 years and $200,000 in student loans, we can come to our own conclusions. The lasting import of great philosophers isn't in telling us to put the toilet seat down and send thank you notes. It's identifying the ethical questions we need to be asking ourselves when we experience life's infinite moral complexities. It's repeating those questions for ourselves in our own specific moral context, which is an awful lot harder than just doing what you're told, which, come to think of it, might be why Heidegger just went along with the whole Nazi thing. In this way, the ethical systems of great thinkers are important, but only in so much as they help us think for ourselves and develop our own moral character and virtues. Just because most philosophers asking the right questions often ended up answering them very, very wrongly, doesn't take away the inherent value of the questions themselves. But what do you all think? Can crappy people still help us figure out how to live a good life? Would you rather trust in philosophers who practice what they preach? Or is that asking too much of folks who struggle to exist outside of the library? Let us know in the comments. A huge thanks to all our patrons for your support. If you enjoy videos like this and want to get deeper into philosophy, even ask me questions and chat about stuff, we have a whole level of our Patreon that's just for that, so check it out. And no matter what, all of our patrons get videos early with no ads. They're on the Discord server. They get extra audio and video content. It's great. But thanks to all of you for supporting us by being here, watching the videos, liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing with people you think might like it. It helps us a lot, feeds the algorithm, and we appreciate it. So in the meantime, try to be more ethical than the dad from Seventh Heaven, and we'll see you later.